Imagine this. You wake up in the dead of night. Everything around you is bathed in a murky darkness. You try to move, your arms, your legs, anything, but your body betrays you. You're frozen, utterly paralyzed, as if an invisible weight pins you to the bed. Suddenly, you notice a presence. It's there, right at the edge of your vision, something tall and dark looming over you. You can't see its face, but you feel its gaze on you, a cold, heavy stare that seems to pierce through the shadows. Terror wraps around your chest, and you realize, with a growing sense of dread, that you're not alone. This is the story of my first sleep paralysis, an experience that made me question the very boundaries between reality and the supernatural. I remember waking up, my eyes fluttering open to the dim light of my room, a pale glow filtering in through the curtains. At first, I thought it was just a normal night, maybe a bad dream. But when I tried to roll over, I couldn't. It felt like something was pressing down on me, forcing me still. My breath quickened, my heart pounded, but my body refused to move. I could see everything around me, the familiar outline of my dresser, the shape of the chair in the corner. But something was wrong. There was an inexplicable chill, a sense that the air itself had thickened, weighed down by something unseen. And then I saw it, out of the corner of my eye, a shape, tall, impossibly dark, and standing right beside my bed. I couldn't make out any details. It was just a shadow, a figure darker than the night itself. The fear that gripped me was unlike anything I had ever felt. It was primal, a deep, gut-wrenching terror that left me feeling exposed, vulnerable. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound escaped my lips. The room was so silent that I could hear my own panicked breathing, rapid and shallow, mixing with the deafening thud of my heart. The figure didn't move, but I felt its presence grow heavier, more oppressive. It was like the air was being sucked out of the room, every breath becoming harder to draw. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this a dream? Some kind of waking nightmare? Or was it real? Was there really something standing there? Something that defied explanation? I tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, that it was all just my imagination. But then, slowly, the figure began to lean closer. And that's when I saw its eyes, two hollow voids, staring straight into mine. They were empty, yet filled with a darkness that seemed alive, writhing in the shadows. And in that moment, I knew, whatever this was, it wasn't human. The terror was paralyzing, my thoughts spiraling out of control. I had heard stories of demons, of spirits that visited in the dead of night, feeding off fear, but I had never imagined it would happen to me. The weight on my chest grew heavier, and I felt tears well up in my eyes, the utter helplessness overwhelming me. I couldn't move, couldn't fight back, and that realization brought a new wave of panic. The figure stayed there, leaning over me, watching. It felt like an eternity, time stretching into something unbearable, as if I were trapped in a waking nightmare with no escape. This was my first encounter with sleep paralysis, though at the time, I had no idea what that even was. I truly believed I was face to face with something from beyond, a demon, a spirit, something that had come to torment me. And as I lay there, unable to move, unable to scream, I was certain of only one thing. I was not alone in that room. And what was there with me, watching, waiting, was something that no words could ever fully describe. The story begins in my childhood bedroom, a room that, by day, seemed completely normal, a place of comfort filled with childhood memories and the faint scent of old books. But by night, it transformed. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the room seemed to take on a life of its own, each shadow stretching and shifting, the once familiar corners now veiled in mystery. The air turned cold, and the silence became almost too heavy, a stillness that felt unnatural. I remember the room as if I'm standing in it now. The narrow bed pushed against the wall, the nightstand with its tiny lamp, and the window that looked out into the darkness of our backyard, a window that seemed to invite the unknown in once night had fallen. The moonlight would seep in through the thin curtains, casting long, faintly glowing lines across the floor. On most nights, Those pale rays brought comfort, but that night, they brought something different, an ominous forewarning. The way the light fell, it illuminated parts of the room, leaving other areas in pitch black, places where the shadows gathered, thick and impenetrable. The chair in the corner, a place where I used to drape my clothes, now looked like an eerie silhouette, almost as if something was sitting there, watching silently. The closet door, which had been left slightly ajar, yawned open, its dark interior like a gaping maw, leading to who knew what. There was a strange feeling in the room that night, something I hadn't felt before. It wasn't just the shadows or the silence. It was an invisible weight, a tension that made my skin crawl. It felt as if I was being watched, and no matter how much I tried to shake off that feeling, it wouldn't leave me. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside seemed amplified, echoing in the thick stillness. My heart pounded my chest, an anxious rhythm that matched the growing unease. The air seemed colder than usual, with a chill that bit into my skin, the type of cold that reached deep, almost touching the bones. I remember glancing at the window, half expecting to see something staring back at me from the other side of the glass. The darkness beyond was so absolute that it felt like anything could be out there, hidden just beyond the line of sight. My imagination ran wild. Shadows of branches moving with the wind looked like skeletal fingers, reaching out, scratching at the walls. And then there was the silence. It wasn't just an ordinary quiet. It was thick, almost suffocating, like a void that had swallowed every sound. The usual nighttime noises, the distant hum of cars, the rustle of leaves, were absent, replaced by an unnatural stillness. Suddenly, amidst that silence, I heard it, a noise that seemed out of place. It was subtle, almost too faint to notice at first, a soft rustling sound like fabric brushing against fabric, coming from the direction of the chair in the corner. My eyes darted over, straining to see through the darkness. The chair, which had once been just a chair, now seemed like something else, something sinister, as if there was a figure sitting there, hunched over, just beyond the edge of the moonlight. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it. The hair on my arms stood up, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. It felt as if there were eyes on me, watching, waiting. The longer I stared, the more certain I became that something was there. The shadows seemed to move, to shift almost imperceptibly, and a shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to look away, to shut my eyes and pretend it wasn't real, but I couldn't. It was like I was drawn to it, unable to break free from the pull of that darkness. I could feel my heart pounding harder, the sound almost deafening in the silence of the room. My breathing grew shallow, every muscle in my body tensed, frozen between the urge to run and the sheer terror that kept me glued in place. And then, the rustling stopped. The silence returned, even heavier than before, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I kept staring at the corner, my eyes wide, straining to see, half expecting something to lunge out of the shadows. But nothing moved. The only thing I could hear now was the sound of my own breathing, ragged and uneven, the sense of dread growing by the second. Whatever was there, it was waiting for me to close my eyes, to let my guard down. And in that moment, I knew that whatever I had thought was familiar about my room, about my home, was gone, replaced by something dark and unknown, something that seemed to exist just beyond the veil of what we consider real. It started with a whisper, so faint that I almost dismissed it as the wind rustling through the trees outside. But this whisper had a different quality, an echoing resonance, as though it originated from within the very walls of my room. It came from somewhere behind me, just beyond the limits of my vision. My body remained paralyzed, my eyes wide open, unable to blink as my ears strained to catch the source of the sound. The whisper grew, shifting into a soft murmur, and a chill crept down my spine, the hairs on my neck standing on end. It was a sound so subtle, yet unmistakably there, one that filled me with a dread I couldn't quite explain. Then, the temperature of the room began to change. What was once a cold, biting chill turned into an unnatural, piercing frigidity. It was as if an icy hand had reached into the room, stealing away every bit of warmth. I could see my own breath, small puffs of mist that hung in the air, dissipating far too slowly. The atmosphere was heavy, pressing against my chest, a suffocating weight that made every breath feel laborious. It felt like something, or someone, was there unseen, watching me struggle, savoring the fear that had taken root in my gut. I could almost hear the silent malice behind that cold presence, a dark energy that seemed to pulse with each desperate beat of my heart. And then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of eyes on me. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a certainty, an instinctual understanding that I was not alone. My gaze shifted toward the darkness, my eyes straining to see something, anything, that could explain this unease. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the darkness playing with my mind. But the sense of being observed was so intense, so unrelenting, that it couldn't be ignored. The shadows at the edge of the room seemed to deepen, the darkness itself feeling almost alive, as if it were shifting, twisting, just out of reach. I focused on the foot of my bed, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness, yet there, moving. It was a slow, deliberate movement, something that seemed to glide across the room without making a sound. My heart pounded louder, my pulse echoing in my ears, drowning out all other noise. The shadow moved closer, almost imperceptibly, as if testing the boundaries, inching its way forward with a sinister patience. I wanted to scream, to thrash, to get away, but my body was a prisoner of whatever force had taken hold. All I could do was watch as the darkness shifted and swirled, an encroaching entity I could neither see clearly nor escape. The whisper returned, clearer now, as though it had crept closer along with the shadow. It wasn't words, more like a breath, an exhalation filled with something that felt ancient, malicious. It was the kind of sound that carried intent, one that spoke directly to my deepest fears. I felt tears pricking the corners of my eyes, an overwhelming terror taking over, a primal fear that screamed for me to escape, even though there was nowhere to go. My eyes were fixed on the foot of my bed, the shadow now taking a more defined shape, taller, more substantial, and I could almost make out the outline of a head, a pair of shoulders. It was watching me, I knew it, even without seeing its eyes. I could feel the weight of its gaze, a gaze that seemed to penetrate the very core of my being. And then came the noise that shattered what little remained of my composure, a creak. The old wooden floorboard groaned, the sound echoing in the silent room. It was unmistakable, a heavy footstep, as if something had finally decided to move towards me. My heart skipped a beat, the fear so raw it felt like ice in my veins. Another creak, closer now, deliberate, as though whatever was there was letting me know it was coming. The weight on my chest grew heavier, the cold so intense it burned, my breath caught in my throat, and all I could do was watch as the figure at the foot of my bed grew clearer, more solid, an ominous presence that seemed to defy all logic and reason. It leaned forward, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt its breath, cold, like the wind blowing from an open grave. The whisper turned into a low growl, a sound that resonated with something primal, something evil. The figure seemed to reach out, and I could feel an invisible force, a pressure that began to close around my throat, tightening, suffocating. My vision blurred, and I thought, for a terrifying moment, that this was the end, that whatever this entity was, it was about to drag me into the darkness from which it came. The terror was absolute, the kind that left no room for rational thought, only the instinct to survive, though I was helpless to do anything about it. I closed my eyes, trying desperately to will the nightmare away, to wake up, to break free from the paralysis. The whisper, the cold, the pressure, it all built to a crescendo, a cacophony of terror that seemed ready to crush me under its weight. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The pressure released, the cold receded, and the whisper faded into silence. My eyes shot open, and the figure was gone. The room was still, eerily calm, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. The terror had been real, the presence undeniable. The shadows may have receded, but I could still feel them, lurking, waiting, just beyond the edge of the light, a reminder that the inexplicable was never far away. The true nightmare began when I found myself caught between two powerful, conflicting instincts: the need to ignore what was happening and pretend it was just a bad dream, and the equally consuming urge to face the terror head-on, to see for myself what lay in the shadows. It was as if two voices were battling in my mind, one begging me to shut my eyes, to retreat into ignorance and safety, and the other daring me to look, taunting me to confront whatever was lurking there, hidden in the darkness. The tension between these two voices was palpable, my body paralyzed with fear, but my mind unable to stop racing, struggling to make a decision that felt impossible. I knew that whatever I decided would change everything. If I chose to ignore it, I could try to convince myself it had all been some strange trick of my mind, something I could eventually forget. But deep down, I also knew that the fear would never truly leave me, that the memory of the figure would always linger in the shadows of my mind, festering, growing, turning my nights into a constant, gnawing dread. But facing it, that felt even more dangerous. There was a real possibility that I might discover something I could never unsee, something that would forever alter my perception of the world. It was like staring into the mouth of an abyss, knowing that what stared back could consume me whole. The seconds stretched on, feeling like hours as I weighed my options. My breathing was shallow, the air seeming to thicken around me, making it harder to draw breath. The weight on my chest was growing heavier, as if whatever was there, whatever was watching, was urging me to decide. There was a soft rustle from the corner of the room, a reminder that I was not alone, and I felt my pulse quicken, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. Every part of me wanted to shut my eyes, to block it all out, to wait for the dawn to come and chase away the shadows. But something deeper, a dark curiosity, began to take hold. That curiosity, that need to know, became an almost irresistible pull. Slowly, painfully, I let my eyes open wider, letting my gaze drift toward the corner of the room. I told myself that it would be better to know the truth, no matter how horrifying it might be. I needed to see it, to face whatever was haunting me, to prove to myself that it was real, that I wasn't losing my mind. The shadows were thick, a solid darkness that seemed to pulse, and for a moment, I thought I could see movement, a shape shifting within them, something almost humanoid, but not quite. The fear was paralyzing, every muscle in my body screaming for me to stop, to look away, but I couldn't. It was like being caught in a spell, a dark enchantment that wouldn't let me go. The figure was there, almost imperceptibly blending with the shadows, but there was no mistaking its presence now. I could see the outline of a head, the suggestion shoulders, a tall, imposing silhouette that seemed to be waiting, watching me. I could almost feel its gaze, a cold, probing stare that seemed to strip away all my defenses, leaving me feeling raw and vulnerable. A sudden thought flashed through my mind. What if it moves? What if it steps closer, reveals itself fully in the pale moonlight? My heart pounded louder, each beat like a drum, the fear reaching an almost unbearable crescendo. And then, as if responding to my thoughts, the figure did move. It shifted, a slow, deliberate motion, a barely perceptible tilt of the head, as if acknowledging me, as if it knew I had chosen to look, to confront it. The terror was absolute. Every instinct told me to run, to get away, but I was frozen, caught in that awful moment, unable to look away. The decision to face it, to truly see what was there, had brought me to this point, caught between worlds, between the safety of ignorance and the horrific reality that lurked just beyond. The figure seemed almost to grow, expanding in the darkness, its presence filling the room, suffocating, a shadow that swallowed all light. My mouth was dry, my throat tight, and though I tried to scream, to call out, no sound came. I was alone, utterly alone, facing something beyond comprehension, something that seemed to feed off my fear, growing stronger the more terrified I became. And then it hit me. I had chosen this. In that desperate, terrifying moment, I realized that my curiosity, my need to know, had led me straight into the jaws of whatever this was. The regret was overwhelming, a wave of panic that almost broke me. I wanted to take it back, to close my eyes, to retreat into the safety of ignorance, but it was too late. The shadows were alive now, moving, reaching, the figure stepping closer, inch by inch, until I could almost feel its presence against my skin, a cold that seemed to burn, a darkness that consumed everything it touched. In that instant, I knew that whatever happened next was beyond my control. I had chosen to confront the unknown, and now the unknown was confronting me. My vision blurred, tears spilling over, the terror too much to bear, and the figure moved again, closer, closer, until it seemed to be right above me. The weight on my chest was crushing now, a suffocating force that pinned me down, and for a moment, I thought I saw its face, an empty void, hollow and endless, a darkness that promised nothing but despair. The moment of confrontation was inevitable. My eyes, now wide open and stinging from the tears that gathered, were locked on the figure looming in the darkness. As it moved closer, there was no mistaking its presence. It wasn't an illusion or a trick of my mind. It was real, and it was standing right at the edge of my bed, its shadowy form nearly blending into the darkness that filled the room. I could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill that seemed to pierce right through my body, numbing my limbs and making it harder to breathe. The air itself felt charged, vibrating with a low, almost inaudible hum that seemed to emanate from deep within the shadows. It was as if the entire room had become a vessel for something otherworldly, something that shouldn't exist. The figure leaned forward, and I could finally make out its face, or rather, the absence of one. The head was featureless, an empty void where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Yet, despite the lack of eyes, I could feel its gaze, cold and probing, as if it could see into my very soul. The fear that gripped me was primal, an all-consuming terror that seemed to disconnect me from reality. My heart raced, and though I tried to move, to break free of the paralysis, my body was completely unresponsive, as if it had betrayed me to the darkness. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own breath, shallow, frantic, almost like gasps. Suddenly, the figure began to change. What was once an indistinct shadow began to solidify, taking on a more grotesque form. The darkness swirled around it, shaping into something almost human, but horribly wrong. The outline of its body became clear. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, fingers stretching out like claws. I watched helpless as it reached towards me, those elongated fingers hovering just above my face. I could feel the energy radiating from them, an overwhelming sense of malice, a darkness that seemed to pull the very warmth from the air. It was like staring into the abyss, knowing that whatever this thing was, it came from a place of pure evil, a place that defied all human understanding. A deep, guttural noise echoed from within the figure, a sound that wasn't quite a growl, but carried a weight of anger, a raw, unfiltered hatred. It filled the room, reverberating off the walls, making my skin crawl. The pressure on my chest intensified, as if unseen hands were pressing down, constricting my lungs, making it harder and harder to draw breath. My vision began to blur at the edges, blackness creeping in as the figure leaned closer still, its featureless face almost touching mine. The cold that emanated from it was unbearable, a bone-chilling frost that seemed to sink into my very core, draining the life from me. In that moment, a thought flashed through my mind. This was it. This was how it ended, taken by some nightmare creature that defied all reason, all reality. The terror was so overwhelming that it left no room for rational thought. All I felt was the urge to escape, to get away from this thing that should not exist. I could feel my mind slipping, the edges of consciousness blurring as the darkness of the figure seemed to grow, swallowing the entire room, leaving nothing but the faint glow of moonlight fading, swallowed by the encroaching shadow. And then, something unexpected happened. A sound, a noise that cut through the suffocating silence, clear and distinct. It was a knock, a firm rap against the bedroom door. My eyes darted to the door, and for the briefest of moments, the figure hesitated. It was as if that sound, that sudden, mundane interruption, had broken whatever spell had been cast over the room. The pressure on my chest lessened slightly, and I could finally draw a full breath, my lungs filling with the cold, stinging air. My vision cleared, and I could see the figure standing there, its head turning slowly towards the door, as if acknowledging the sound, almost irritated by the intrusion. For a split second, I thought I might be saved. Maybe someone was on the other side of that door. Someone who could help me, pull me out of this nightmare. But then, the figure's head snapped back towards me, its featureless face once again inches from mine. The knock came again, louder this time, almost urgent, but the figure didn't move away. Instead, it seemed to grow more defined, the darkness wrapping around it in waves, each movement more fluid and menacing than before. The sense of dread that filled me was unbearable, and I realized that whoever was at the door was just as helpless as I was. They couldn't see what I was seeing. They couldn't fight this thing. I was alone with it, trapped in this room that had become a gateway to some dark, twisted reality. The figure's hand finally touched my forehead, a cold so intense that it burned, and a sharp, agonizing pain shot through me, as if my very soul was being torn from my body. My mouth opened in a silent scream, the sound caught in my throat, unable to escape. The darkness seemed to pulse, a living entity that consumed all light, all warmth, and in that moment, I felt myself slipping, the world around me fading, leaving only the terror, the pain, and the cold. It was as if the figure was trying to pull me into itself, to take me to wherever it had come from, a place of pure, unending darkness. And then, with a suddenness that left me gasping, it was over. The pressure released, the figure vanished, and the cold receded, leaving only the echoes of fear and the sensation of a fading touch on my skin. I could move again, my body jerking upright, gasping for air, my eyes wide and darting around the room. The darkness was still there, but it was just shadows now, mundane and harmless. The door was closed, no sign of the knocks that had seemed so real, and I was left sitting there, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the memory of that faceless figure forever burned into my mind. The terror lingered, the feeling that, though it was gone for now, it wasn't truly over, that somewhere in the darkness, it was still watching, waiting. The climax was a revelation that left me forever altered. As the figure vanished, I was left in a room that seemed both familiar and completely alien, a place that was once my refuge, now tainted by an encounter with something I could barely comprehend. I sat there, trembling, drenched in cold sweat, every nerve in my body still screaming in terror. The air felt wrong, heavy with the lingering residue of something unnatural, as if a gateway had briefly opened and the shadows of another world had spilled through. I was no longer just afraid. I was changed. There was something about that figure, that darkness, that left a mark. Something I couldn't shake. Something that haunted the very corners of my mind. Then I noticed something out of place. Something that hadn't been there before. On the floor, near the edge of the bed where the figure had stood, lay a small, dark object. It was barely visible in the dim light filtering through the curtains, a glint of something metallic catching my eye. My instincts told me to leave it alone, to pretend it wasn't there, but the same curiosity that had driven me to confront the figure pushed me to investigate. I slowly swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet hitting the cold wooden floor, and cautiously leaned forward. My hand trembled as I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the object. A ring, old and tarnished, with strange, intricate symbols carved into its surface. The moment I touched it, a shiver ran down my spine, a deep, primal fear that seemed to emanate from the ring itself. It was cold, far colder than anything should be, and as I picked it up, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if I had just crossed a line that should never have been approached. The symbols carved into the ring seemed to writhe under my gaze, shifting, almost alive, and a nauseating dizziness overcame me, the room spinning, the walls seeming to close in. I wanted to drop it, to let it fall back to the floor, but my hand wouldn't obey. My fingers wrapped tightly around the ring, holding it as if it were an extension of myself. Suddenly, a memory, or perhaps a vision, flashed through my mind. I was no longer in my room, but somewhere else. A dark, endless void, a place where light could not reach. In that vision, I saw the figure again, but this time it wasn't alone. Shapes moved in the darkness, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, all featureless, all watching, waiting. I felt their malice, a deep, overwhelming hatred directed at me, at everything alive. The cold seeped into my bones, the same chilling presence I had felt when the figure had leaned over me, and I knew, with a terrible certainty, that they were not gone. They were still there, just beyond the veil, watching, and the ring was a connection to them, a conduit that had allowed them into my world. The vision ended as suddenly as it had begun, and I was back in my room, gasping for air, my hands still wrapped around the ring. I stumbled back, nearly falling as my legs gave way, the fear overwhelming. I knew I needed to get rid of it, to throw it away, but something stopped me. It was as if the ring had a hold on me, a power that went beyond anything physical. I could feel it, a presence that lingered in my mind, whispering to me, promising answers, promising knowledge. The rational part of me, the part that screamed that this was dangerous, that I was playing with forces I couldn't understand, was drowned out by that whisper, a seductive pull that seemed to reach into the deepest recesses of my thoughts. I tried to steady my breathing, to calm my racing heart, but it was impossible. The room still felt wrong, the shadows too deep, too dark, as if they were hiding something just out of sight. I glanced around, half expecting to see the figure standing there again, watching, waiting. But the room was empty, silent, the only sound my own ragged breaths. And yet, the sense of being watched hadn't left me. It was as if the entire house had changed, the walls themselves seeming to pulse with a dark energy, something ancient and malevolent. The realization hit me then. This wasn't over. It had never been about just one encounter. The figure, the ring, the shadows, they were all connected, all part of something much larger, something that I had inadvertently become a part of. The revelation was terrifying. I was no longer just a bystander. By confronting the figure, by touching the ring, I had opened a door that couldn't be closed. The darkness had found me, and it wouldn't let go. The whispers in my mind grew louder, the symbols on the ring seeming to dance before my eyes, and I knew that the terror I had experienced was only the beginning. Whatever it was that had come for me, it wasn't finished. The shadows were still there, still watching, and now they knew me. The fear that gripped me was different now. It was no longer just about the figure or the paralysis. It was a fear of what was to come, of what I had invited into my life, and the chilling certainty that no matter how much I tried to escape, the darkness would always find me. With the ring clutched in my hand, I felt the weight of that realization settle over me. I was marked, connected to something that went beyond the physical world, something that thrived in the shadows, unseen but always present. And as I sat there, alone in the darkness, I knew that I could never look at my room, my home, or even my own reflection the same way again. The terror was not just about what I had seen, but about what I had yet to see, about the knowledge that the shadows held secrets, and now, those secrets were a part of me. The end of that night left me deeply shaken, my world irrevocably altered by an experience that I could neither fully understand nor forget. As dawn began to break, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the thin curtains of my room, casting a golden glow that should have brought me comfort. But instead, it only served to highlight how little solace light could offer now. The sun rose, but the darkness within me, the fear that had taken root, refused to be banished. I could still feel the cold touch on my skin, the memory of that oppressive presence lingering like a phantom that refused to let go. I was alive, yes, but I knew that I would never be the same again. I cautiously rose from my bed, my legs trembling as they struggled to hold my weight. The room seemed almost normal now, the shadows retreating, the familiar shapes and outlines of my belongings gradually returning to focus. But nothing about it felt right. I could see the sunlight, but there was a dullness to it, as if the world itself had lost its color, drained by the entity that had visited me. My eyes drifted to the ring that still lay in my hand, its surface now looking deceptively harmless, nothing more than a piece of tarnished metal. But I knew better. The symbols carved into it seemed to hum with an energy that I couldn't ignore, an unspoken promise that whatever had come for me wasn't finished. I wanted to get rid of it, to throw it away, to cast it into the deepest, darkest place I could find. But an inexplicable force held me back, a whisper in my mind that spoke of consequences, of unseen dangers if I dared to let it go. The ring was a part of me now, a reminder of that night, of the shadows that had almost claimed me. I stumbled out of my room, the hallways of my house feeling unfamiliar, almost hostile. Every creak of the floorboards, every shifting shadow seemed to harbor a hidden threat. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I was struck by the terrifying thought that my own home had become something I no longer recognized, a place tainted by whatever had reached across the veil and touched me. As I reached the kitchen, I splashed cold water on my face, hoping that the sensation would somehow break through the lingering haze of fear to ground me back in reality. The icy water stung, but it did little to wash away the unease that clung to me like a second skin. My reflection in the window caught my eye, and I froze. For a split second, I saw it again, a figure standing behind me, a dark shape that seemed to shift and writhe in the faint morning light. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there, just the empty room, the morning silence thick with tension. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling, as I tried to convince myself that it had been nothing more than my imagination, a trick played by my exhausted mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. The figure, the darkness, it hadn't left. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. The feeling of being watched had never truly disappeared, a presence that lingered just beyond sight, hidden in the corners, waiting for the next opportunity to reveal itself. I knew then that this was my new reality, an existence where the line between the natural and the supernatural had been blurred, a life spent always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if the shadows held something more sinister than the absence of light. The rest of the day passed in a haze, the mundane tasks of daily life feeling almost alien. Every noise, every flicker of movement caught in my peripheral vision set my nerves on edge. The ring never left my hand, and though I wanted to be rid of it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow tied to me now, that discarding it would only make things worse. The whispers that had filled my mind during the night were gone, but the silence that replaced them was almost worse, a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to hum with a threat of its own. I could feel the weight of what had happened pressing down on me, a suffocating reminder that the shadows were never far away. That night, as darkness once again descended upon the house, I felt the familiar dread return, creeping in with the lengthening shadows. I tried to avoid looking at the corners of my room, to ignore the way the darkness seemed to move, shifting in ways that defied explanation. I kept the lights on, every lamp and bulb blazing in a futile attempt to ward off the inevitable. But even in the light, I could feel it. The presence, the cold, the lingering memory of eyes that had no form, yet saw everything. The weight of the ring in my hand was a constant reminder of that night, of the encounter that had torn open a hole between my world and something much darker. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew sleep would not come easily, if at all. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to rest, racing with thoughts of what I had seen, of what might still be lurking just beyond the edge of perception. I tried to tell myself that it was over, that the figure wouldn't come back, but the fear in my chest told me otherwise. The darkness had found me once, and it would find me again. It was only a matter of time. The shadows, the whispers, the cold, they were all a part of me now, a constant reminder that the world was far more terrifying than I had ever imagined. The natural conclusion of my story was not a happy ending. There was no escape, no return to the safety and comfort I had once known. I was forever changed, marked by an encounter with something that defied understanding. And as I lay there, waiting for the dawn, I knew that the terror was not something I could outrun. It was with me, always, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when the lights would fail and the darkness would take hold once more. The ring, the figure, the cold, they were all a promise, a reminder that the true horror of the world was not what could be seen, but what lay just beyond the light, in the darkness that waited patiently, endlessly, for us to notice it. The days that followed were a blur, filled with an unease that seemed to have settled into my very bones. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a deep, unshakable awareness that my life had been irrevocably altered. The sunlight that streamed through the windows during the day did little to comfort me. It only served as a stark reminder of how fleeting safety was. I could feel the dark presence lingering even in the daylight, hidden in the corners of my vision, a shadow that seemed to pulse with malevolence, always just out of sight. The ring, still clutched tightly in my hand, had become a constant, unwelcome companion. It was a cold reminder of that night, a link to a world I had glimpsed, a world of darkness, mystery, and terror. I tried to go about my daily life, to pretend that everything was normal. But every time I passed a mirror, every time I saw my reflection, I felt it. It was in my eyes, an emptiness, a haunted look that spoke of something that could never be unseen. I was no longer just a person living in a familiar world. I was someone who had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. I could see it in my reflection. The tired eyes, the pallor of my skin, the way I flinched at every shadow, every creak of the house settling. My own reflection had become a stranger, someone who had been marked by the darkness, someone who could never truly escape what had happened. At night, the terror returned in full force. Even with the lights on, even with every lamp blazing, I could feel it. The cold, the weight on my chest, the sense of being watched, it was all there, hovering at the edge of my awareness. I knew that the figure could return at any moment, that was merely waiting for the right time, the right conditions to slip through again. The whispers I had heard, the guttural growl that had filled the room, they echoed in my mind, replaying over and over until I could hardly tell if they were real or imagined. Sleep was elusive, and when it did come, it brought no peace, only nightmares filled with shadowy figures and a sense of suffocating dread. There were times when I thought about reaching out, about telling someone, anyone, what had happened. But how could I explain it? How could I make someone understand the terror of that night? The figure that had stood at the edge of my bed, the cold touch that had seemed to reach beyond the physical and into my very soul. People would think I was crazy, and perhaps, in some way, I was. The boundaries between reality and nightmare had blurred, and I no longer knew where one ended and the other began. The ring was my secret, my burden, and I carried it with me like a chain that bound me to the darkness. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. The idea of letting it go filled me with a fear that I couldn't quite explain, as if discarding it would invite something far worse. Weeks passed, and I began to notice subtle changes. It wasn't just a fear that lingered. It was something more. I would see things out of the corner of my eye. Fleeting shapes that seemed to disappear the moment I turned my head, dark figures that lingered in the periphery of my vision. The house, once so familiar, had become a labyrinth of shadows, each corner hiding the possibility of another encounter. The feeling of being watched never left me, and I knew, deep down, that the figure was still there. Perhaps it was no longer bound to the darkness of the night. Perhaps, by touching that ring, I had invited it into my life in a way that went beyond the physical, a connection that couldn't be severed. The whispers returned, faint at first, a low murmur that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the intent was clear. Something was calling to me, something that wanted me to listen, to give in. I found myself drawn to the ring, staring at the symbols carved into its surface, trying to decipher their meaning, their purpose. There was a pull, an almost magnetic attraction that I couldn't resist. The more I stared, the more I felt myself slipping, as if the ring was a doorway, a portal to a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. One night, I decided to put it on. I don't know what drove me to it, whether it was the whispers, the curiosity, or simply a desire to understand. As I slid the ring onto my finger, a chill ran through me, colder than anything I had felt before. The room seemed to darken, the lights dimming, the shadows deepening until they were almost tangible, pressing in on me from all sides. The air grew heavy, and I felt the weight return to my chest, the familiar sense of being watched, of not being alone. I looked down at my hand, the ring now fitting perfectly, and I knew that I had made a terrible mistake. The whispers grew louder, clearer, and for the first time, I understood. They weren't just random sounds. They were words, a command, a call to something beyond, something that waited in the darkness. As the realization dawned on me, the room seemed to shift, the walls trembling, the shadows moving with a life of their own. I saw it then, not just one figure, but many, shapes emerging from the darkness, all watching me, all reaching out with those long, claw-like fingers. The terror was overwhelming, and I knew that I had crossed a line from which there was no return. The figures were here now, in my home, in my life, and they weren't going anywhere. I had invited them in, and now they were part of my reality, a constant presence that I could never escape. The ring pulsed with a dark energy, the symbols glowing faintly, and I felt an unholy connection to whatever world these entities had come from. It was as if I could feel their thoughts, their desires, their hunger. The fear that filled me was unlike anything I had ever known, a deep, existential dread that reached into my very being, stripping away any illusion of safety, any hope of escape. I was theirs now, bound to the darkness, marked by the figures that had come for me that night. And as I stood there, surrounded by the shifting shadows, the whispers growing into a deafening roar, I realized that this was my new existence. There would be no peace, no safety, no comfort in the daylight. The figures were with me, always, waiting for the moment when I would let my guard down, waiting to drag me into the darkness from which they had come. The terror was not just about what I had seen. It was about what was yet to come, the knowledge that the world I had once known was gone, replaced by a nightmare from which there was no waking. And as the darkness closed in, I knew that my story was far from over. It had only just begun.